Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafetz, and welcome to Law on Film, a podcast that explores the rich connections between law and film. Law is critical to many films. Film, in turn, tells us a lot about the law. In each episode, we'll look at a film that's noteworthy from a legal perspective. What issues does the film explore? What does it get right about the law, and what does it get wrong? How is law important to understanding the film, and what does the film teach us about the law and the larger social and cultural context in which it operates? This episode, we look at Juror number 2, Clint Eastwood's most recent and perhaps final film. Juror number 2 centers around the trial of a man accused of murdering his girlfriend after a fight at a bar, leaving her in a ditch by the side of a road. The twist comes early. Justin Kemp, aka Juror number 2, played by Nicholas Hoult, soon realizes that the wrong man is on trial. As he hears the evidence, Kemp figures out that he and not the defendant killed the victim, accidentally hitting her with his car while she was walking along the side of a road on a dark and rainy night, and Kemp thinking at the time that he hit a deer. After realizing the truth, Kemp, otherwise portrayed as a good man, a loving husband, with a beautiful wife and a baby on the way, must navigate the moral dilemma as he serves on a jury that seems prepared to condemn an innocent man. Eastwood's first courtroom drama in a long and legendary career, Juror number 2 explores themes of truth, justice, morality, and the human nature of the legal system. I'm joined for this episode by Frank Wohl. A founding partner of Lankler, Sifford, and Wohl, Frank Wohl has appeared as a prosecutor or defense counsel in numerous criminal trials and appeals, and as plaintiff or defense counsel in civil cases. Over his distinguished career, Frank has represented a wide range of individuals and institutions. He's also devoted a substantial portion of his practice to attorney ethics matters, defending lawyers and law firms, appearing as an expert witness, and serving on city, state, and federal ethics committees. Frank previously served in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, where he was appointed Assistant Chief of the Criminal Division and subsequently Chief of the Civil Division. Frank also previously served as President of the Federal Bar Council. Welcome, Frank. Great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's really fun to be here.
So after the jurors are selected and before the trial begins, the judge, no-nonsense judge, I should add, shares with the jury her view of the process, explaining that as flawed as it may be, it's still the best chance at achieving justice.
See, the fact that you don't want to be here is exactly what makes you the perfect group to adjudicate this case. You are impartial. You have no skin in the game, nothing to gain or lose. And that is why I believe that this process, as flawed as it may be, is still our best chance at finding justice.
The movie seems to reveal many of these flaws. What are a few of them?
I think you're right, Jonathan. There are numerous flaws. And first, I want to just say I found that a very odd statement by the judge. I have never been in a trial where a judge has said something like that. In fact, I think what you're normally trying to do as a judge is convince the jurors or inspire the jurors to take everything very seriously and make sure they get it right. Here you have a judge referring to the system as, she says, perhaps flawed. And I think in many ways that's the key to the movie, because this movie is really about, it's not so much a trial drama, and it's not so much a jury drama like 12 Angry Men. It's more a drama about the whole criminal justice system. And as you said, sort of a good man who is caught in an almost Kafkaesque circumstance of trying to work his way through and survive in a fraught situation, survive in a criminal justice system that really doesn't help him very much. And as the judge said, the system is indeed flawed, because it looks to me as though you have bad police work, you have initially a bad prosecution preparation, a failure to prosecute. You have a medical examiner who gives extremely flawed testimony. You have an eyewitness who gives flawed testimony. You have a defense lawyer totally fails to do his job. You have numerous jurors who come in with prejudices or preconceptions who, as you said, are sort of start out being ready to convict. You even have the protagonist going to a lawyer and getting really flawed advice. And you have a judge who just sits there passively and allows this legal train wreck to happen, with the result that, as you said, an innocent person is going to get convicted and ultimately face life in prison. And the interesting drama here is, and maybe you have thoughts about where this fits in the overall film genre, but it's about a system that doesn't work very well. And then some outsider comes in, somebody who's really not supposed to be part of the system, whether it's a cowboy riding on a white hat, whether it's some guy, the private in the army who all of a sudden saves the day. But here it's a juror who really by some fluke happens to be very experienced and sees through the web of failures here that really is causing a great deal of misery.
Yeah, it's interesting. They get into the jury room and they start deliberating. And here's where one sort of thing I think I see a comparison with 12 Angry Men, although it's certainly not a perfect fit, right? All the jurors, well, virtually all the jurors are for sort of immediate conviction, right? They articulate, as in 12 Angry Men, if you remember in that jury room, it was like 100 degrees in the summer. One of them wanted to go to a ball game. They want to get out of there. They thought the guy was guilty. They want to be done before lunch, right? And that's sort of the impression you get. They go around, they're all voting to convict. And then it's juror number 2, who knows he committed the crime, who gets in the way, right? He sort of, takes on like the Henry Fonda persona of, we've got reasonable doubt. We need to consider this. I think largely because he's trying to, he doesn't want the wrong guy to go to jail. He doesn't want to go to jail, right? And so he pushes back. And then we get the juror you mentioned, the former retired police detective. Harold Chakowski's his name in the movie. It's played by J.K. Simmons, who's great in the role. And he, sort of says, basically puts his cards on the table, says, I'm the retired police detective. I don't know how they let me on this jury, but something isn't right. So he conducts his own investigation. He thinks it's a hit and run, drives to the crime scene, pulls records to see what other vehicles were brought in for the type of repairs consistent with a hit and run. And then the judge learns what he was doing, thanks to juror number 2, make sure he gets caught because, juror number 2 realized then suspicion might turn on him. And the judge then conducts a hearing to declare a mistrial.
Read instruction 0.01 for me, please.
To maintain the integrity of the jury system, I remind you that you must decide this case based only on the evidence admitted during the trial and the law I will explain to you. You may not conduct any research on your own about this case or about any people or places mentioned during the trial.
Sounds to me like you two violated every sentence of that paragraph.
Your Honor, I move for a mistrial. He's a former cop who knows what ideas he put in the jury's heads.
Failure to elicit his previous employment during voir dire is on you, Mr. Resnick.
It's misconduct.
Kick him off, Judge. There's no need to start over. Our resources are already stretched so thin.
She's right. Motion denied.
Your Honor,
As for you two, you violated your oath as jurors.
Your Honor, if I may, I upheld the oath I took as a police officer to never betray my character, my integrity, or the public trust.
Mr. Chakowski, you are hereby removed from jury service. On account of your background, I'm going to make an exception and not find you in contempt of court.
Thank you, Your Honor.
So, Mr. Kemp, you are not a retired law enforcement officer, are you?
No, Your Honor.
So how do you explain your involvement in this transgression?
I obtained those documents on my own, Your Honor. He didn't have anything to do with it.
Is that true? I mean, did you look at these documents or help to procure them or know what Mr. Chakowski was intending to do?
No, Your Honor, I did not look at them and I didn't help.
So do you think that you can disregard everything that you heard just now and remain an unbiased member of this panel?
Yes, I can.
I'm going to take you at your word. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Kemp back to the juror room. Mr. Chakowski, you are dismissed.
Your Honor, I would ask that a copy of these documents be made part of the court's records for purposes of appeal. And again, I move for a mistrial.
Documents will be marked as Court's Exhibit 1. Your motion for mistrial is denied, Mr. Resnick. Is that understood?
Yes, Your Honor. It's understood.
Good. Then we are done here.
So what was your impression of sort of what juror number 2 does, the investigation, the colloquy with the judge, not declaring a mistrial, and this whole thing with this police detective / juror?
I thought, first of all, juror number 2, he's such a decent person. which I think makes the movie really interesting. And part of his decency is he sees the opportunity to really get out of this problem by just letting them convict the guy that's on trial. And instead, he stands in the way of that. And I think that reveals his character in lots of ways. Then later on, he gets into the predicament that they're going to end up with a hung jury, and we can talk about it later, the kind of legal advice he gets, which is that a hung jury is really not going to work. So I think that was a very interesting interaction. And I thought a lot of the interaction among the jurors was pretty realistic, although I have to say, lawyers are always really just speculating about what goes on in the jury room because they don't very often get the chance to see it in quite the way we saw it here. You do get focus groups and things like that where we stage trials or mock trials and you get to see them. But I think there are situations where they start out all one way. Somebody says, not so fast. I mean, this is a murder case. This guy's going to go away for life. I think it's quite common for jurors to say, this is a serious kind of situation. Just having our sandwiches for lunch and coming back just doesn't feel good. So then you get him sort of slowing the train down. And as you said, Tchaikovsky is the one that really, I think, digs into this the most. But there's also a medical student who was really seemed to be very realistic. And she points out that the victim had some broken bones in addition to the skull fracture that the medical examiner testified about. So she's got some issues there. And it is, I think, not uncommon for jurors to go off and do their own research. All the judges always tell them not to do that, but particularly today in the world of the internet, it's just very tempting to go home and start looking up the answers to questions about what did some of these legal terms mean? Does it really make sense to say that, somebody who dies in the way that the medical examiner said is necessarily hit with a blunt instrument or not? All kinds of things like that. And lawyers always speculate that jurors are doing that. Of course, we oftentimes don't know because we don't find out about it. But I don't think very many lawyers operate under the assumption that jurors always abide by those instructions. And particularly true in a case that's got some publicity, which this case did have. There was a newspaper article about it, so it's pretty likely that somebody went home and read the article.
So when it comes to the judge's attention that Tchaikovsky, the J.K. Simmons character, did all this research, she has them both in at the bench and deciding whether to declare a mistrial. She says no mistrial. She dismisses Tchaikovsky and she lets juror number 2 stay, thinking he wasn't really involved and he wasn't really going to influence his decision. How did that sort of ruling or scene strike you?
It struck me as somewhat unrealistic, actually. I would think in that situation, the judge would lean in the direction of declaring a mistrial. I mean, this is a murder case. And the apparent situation is the case has only gone on for 2 or 3, maybe 4 days. So it's not a long, long trial where it's going to be wasted. And she doesn't conduct much of an inquiry. Really, it's a rather perfunctory inquiry. The real issue is, have the jurors been infected by this improper information? And the issue is, how about juror number 2, who has seen some of the information and has talked to Tchaikovsky? And then the issue is, well, have they in any way conveyed this information to any of the other jurors? Now, I would think that a defense lawyer, unless he really loves this jury and he thinks he's accomplished a lot so far, is going to certainly ask for a mistrial. I think the defense lawyer in this case did ask for a mistrial. And if he doesn't get it, he's going to ask the judge to do some inquiry of the remaining jurors. I would think that the judge would do that. And I just don't see any reason why you would send juror number 2 back into the jury room, because juror number 2, he says he hasn't really learned anything. I think that at that point, we know that he has at least had a hallway conversation with Tchaikovsky. That's not good. And how can you control what's going to happen with him? So why send him back in there? So she's got 2 choices, which seem to me to make a certain amount of sense. One is to declare a mistrial, start over again. The other one would be to kick them both off the jury and then put on two alternates. I'm assuming they would have two alternates and at least. And I would think in a case like this, you would have probably maybe four alternates. So that shouldn't be a problem. So I did not think her resolution of it made a lot of sense, but it sort of relates to her passivity in the whole situation. I mean, she's not a very active judge.
You mentioned before about the legal advice that juror number 2, Justin Kemp, gets, right? The other sort of feature of him, which I think, adds to the audience sympathy, is he's a recovering alcoholic, right? And the night in question when the woman is killed happens, he was actually at the bar where the fight happened, and he was it was the, I think, anniversary of when they had his wife had lost their last child during a pregnancy, and he went to the bar, was going to have a relapse, and kind of pulls out of it, right? And driving back, and she actually texts him, and I guess another lesson is don't read your text when you drive. He looks at the text, next he hits the woman, but he's a recovering alcoholic, right? So and it turns out his sponsor, played by Kiefer Sutherland, is a lawyer, right? So he goes to Kiefer Sutherland at 2 points, right? One, sort of early on when he realized what happened, and then later, I think as you alluded to, when he's asking, what happens if there's a mistrial. What did you think of the advice he got? You described it as sort of flawed.
The Kiefer Sutherland lawyer really did not do his job. The conversation starts out with, give me $1, and now it's covered by attorney-client privilege. And that's sort of a joke lawyers tell each other all the time. And in fact, it would be covered by attorney-client privilege, whether he gave him $1 or not, because he's going to a lawyer, he's trying to get legal advice, and that's what the attorney-client privilege is all about. And it's expected that the whole thing is going to be confidential. I think the problem is that the lawyer hardly takes his inquiry seriously. I mean, he listens to his story, and he tells him that nobody's going to believe you if you tell that story. He doesn't really penetrate the situation. He does not discuss with the client alternative strategies that he might use, and he doesn't discuss with him the risks that are involved here. And he also really tilts the advice that he gives to almost compel Justin to take what I consider to be the wrong approach and say nothing and stay on this jury, because he basically says, look, nobody's going to believe you. And if you come forward, you can end up getting 30 years to life. Justin, on the other hand, asks exactly the right question. He says, if I come forward now and tell the truth, that's got to count for something. And this lawyer gives him this really cynical advice, essentially, no, you'll end up getting 30 years to life. Now, why might he not get 30 years to life? Well, for one thing, his story is that he didn't know that he had hit anybody. So he thought he hit a deer. There's a big sign there that says deer crossing. You don't have a legal obligation to report hitting a deer. So he's got a position that he didn't really do anything wrong. And I think he would get a lot of sympathy if he came forward. He's going to get zero sympathy having sat on that jury, infected the entire process, allowed an innocent person that he knows is innocent to get sentenced to 30 years to life. The lawyer could have thought about some, much more detailed analysis of the situation. And one of the big questions is, okay, Justin, if you go down this road of saying nothing, what are the chances that this whole problem is going to come out one way or another? How could that happen? Well, maybe the defense lawyer is going to do the same kind of investigation that we later learned that the juror did, of start looking around for cars, think about that it's a hit and run, because that seems like a pretty decent defense theory. Develop that, and it's going to lead to you. Another possibility is they do enough to get an acquittal, and then the prosecution is going to start looking for the real person who was responsible for this. I suppose another possibility is you could have a conviction, and then the Innocence Project picks up the case, and they want to investigate this, and they ultimately figure out you did what you did. So it's a dangerous strategy, it seems to me. And none of these dangers, none of these risks are discussed by the lawyer. He does this very offhand kind of way. And I think that that's a big problem with him. And then when Justin comes back to him later and says, it looks like we're going to have a hung jury, he says, oh, if you get a hung jury, you're really in trouble, because then they're going to do a retrial and they'll be looking for who really did it, and you could get caught that way. So you need a verdict. And that causes Justin to then, I guess it's not shown, that the deliberations are actually not shown in the film, but I guess Justin is persuasive enough that he gets the jurors to then convict. And I think that lawyer at that point is coming pretty close to a participation in obstruction of justice and jury misconduct. If he doesn't get prosecuted, I think he could easily have an investigation and proceeding by the local bar association. And he might have a decent argument that he didn't really participate. He was just giving legal advice, but he's going to have a lot of pain. And also, he's really led this client into just a terrible, terrible predicament. And also, it's another thing that I thought of here. When a client comes into your office in one of these difficult situations, you look at the legal issues, but you also look at the client and the client's psychological makeup or personality. The way this oftentimes confronts itself in the criminal defense world is some clients are capable of going through the criminal justice system, and it does not faze them particularly, so that they're able to navigate it and they can handle whatever comes. Other clients, you can see immediately, do not have the psychological strength to do that. This is going to tear them apart. And so doing anything that has risk to it is going to be very difficult for them. And it's very clear that Justin is really in that latter category. After the verdict, he goes to James Sykes' sentencing because he feels so bad about it. That's a really unusual thing for a juror to do, but we know why he does it. And then after Sykes is sentenced to 30 years to life, I think it's after that, he actually goes to the dead woman's grave and prays over her grave and leaves flowers on it. And then we see a little scene where he's at his home and he looks out the window and there's some police cars driving by. And you know what Clint Eastwood is telling us? He's telling us this guy for the rest of his life is going to be torn apart by this. So the lawyer's failure to really provide Justin with valuable legal advice and guidance, I found quite disturbing.
So he's one of the lawyers, right? And then the other two lawyers we see, right? The main ones are the prosecutor, Faith Killebrew, played by Toni Collette, and then Eric Resnick, who's the public defender, played by Chris Messina. So, a couple of things here. One, Faith Killebrew, Toni Collette character, is pushing this case. She's trying this case. She's also running for DA in Savannah, Georgia. So small city where the film takes place. There's a lot of political pressure and kind of a high profile trials with political opportunity. And so she's sort of kind of, in some ways, the pivotal character, right? She's the one who ultimately has her mind changed, and then, partly by the Chakowski, the police detective juror, and then goes and conducts the investigation that the police should have conducted. I don't know, what did you think of her character and her interactions with the public defender?
I thought her character was a little more ambiguous in that, I guess what I'm saying is she didn't get everything wrong. I think she was pretty strange to me that she got herself into that trial with really inadequate preparation. And what do I mean by that? The key to the prosecution's case, and by the way, this is a really thin case. This is a very thin case that they're going with here. The key to the case is the eyewitness identification. And the eyewitness identification is totally flawed. It's based on a highly suggestive photo lineup that would probably be excluded in most trials. And the way it's presented in the movie, she doesn't find out about that until I think the jury is out. It's certainly the trial has already started and she's already put this guy on the witness stand. I think most prosecutors would expect the police to have conducted an appropriate photo lineup. They would have several records of the witness identification that she would have gone over. She would probably talk to her witness and found out about the lineup. And she doesn't do any of that. And by the way, I don't think the judge would have just sat there and allowed this eyewitness testimony to come in. I mean, if she looks over at the defense table and the guy is asleep or something like that, she would have said, "Hey, Mr. Resnick, are you satisfied that this is admissible? Do you want to inquire about this photo lineup? You got any questions?" We don't see any of that, by the way. But Killebrew does come to her senses, and even though the movie pushes the idea of the political influence or political pressure on her, at the end of the movie, Justin pushes that button as well and basically says, look, if you do anything to undermine this prosecution or this conviction, it's going to be bad for your career. And she essentially rejects that, and she decides to go forward, and the movie ends with her showing up at his doorstep and probably about to arrest him. So I thought she did the right thing. And I thought she, except for her failure to prepare the case and deal with the eyewitness situation, and also I thought the medical examiner's testimony was pretty flawed as well. So I was a little surprised that that just sailed through. But, you know, I understand that in a movie, you might want to cut a few corners. And so they do that. But I thought I don't know whether it's quite fair to say she's the hero of the movie at the end or not, but because we're all in a sort of ambiguous situation. As you said, we're highly sympathetic to Justin, at least I was. And on the other hand, his arguments at the end of the movie as to why she should just let him go don't pass muster.
You know, it does sort of suggest, I mean, about the kind of unreliability of the eyewitness testimony, and how when Killebrew goes and questions the eyewitness, it's very clear that he was sort of just kind of felt needed. That idea that he was going to be something important. Her relations with the public defender are also kind of interesting. I mean, you see them kind of bantering before when they're trying to talk about maybe a plea. And then during the trial, they sort of talk about in a bar over drinks after the proceedings are done. They talk about the case and the justice system. So, you've practiced in New York, very large city, but so maybe experience is different in a smaller town. But I don't know, did you ever, well, on either side, you've been on both sides, you have a drink during the case with your opposing counsel, or, it was a kind of interesting kind of relation between the two of them.
Yeah, it was interesting. I didn't feel that it crossed the line and became problematical at all. I would assume that particularly in smaller communities, that can happen. And I also think that even in New York, it's not uncommon for defense lawyers to be quite friendly with prosecutors. Maybe they would not have a drink right during a trial, but they might very well, teach together or, have lunch together at some point, always being careful as to who pays for the lunch. And I think that probably is more true in smaller cities. I guess what I was bothered by was it just seemed to me that defense lawyer Resnick was a lot more interested in ingratiating himself and, bringing her flowers for her when she won the election and having drinks with her than doing his homework and figuring out that particularly the eyewitness identification that's a huge area in the law. That is, you have to look at the circumstances of the photo array. There has to be an array. It can't be just one photograph. The police department has to keep records of what the photo array was. They have to create a written report. The written report has to be turned over to the defense lawyers. If the defense lawyers say, hey, where's the written report? It's going to raise a lot of eyebrows when there isn't one. He's probably got a good motion to exclude the eyewitness identification here. So, he doesn't do any of that. Instead, he's having drinks with her and giving her flowers.
I mean, he does sort of, seem to genuinely believe and argue for his client's innocence in terms of actually doing the hard work of trying to establish reasonable doubt, maybe less than thorough. And then there's this interesting scene where after Killebrew is sort of skeptical, right? She says, I want to speak to him, right? I don't speak to the defendant, Sykes. And so she goes to the jail, obviously, with the defense counsel's permission. He's there, and just sort of ask him, see if she can sort of discern the truth by questioning him. So she, asks him, these things to try to see, did he really do it? And the defendant maintains his innocence. What about that scene?
I mean, I thought it was good theater, but I think in the real world, I suppose occasionally, somebody's story will fall apart, but I think that particularly a seasoned DA is going to recognize that some of these guys can lie and convince her that, the moon is made out of green cheese or whatever. And so I thought that what really turned her around was the vehicle records and, quite frankly, the absence of any vehicle records related to the defendant's car. And, she's smart enough to know that the eyewitness identification is now highly suspect. And now she's got his car with this kind of injury that is consistent with a hit and run. And he's behaving very strangely. I don't think she's really turned around until after he showed up at the sentencing. And then they have this quite odd conversation on the park bench where he's talking hypothetically, but it's pretty clear that it's not that hypothetical. I thought it was fine to have her go interview him. And I thought Resnick hasn't anything to lose at that point because he's already been convicted.
Now, let's talk about that park bench conversation. This is after she has this sort of moment of epiphany in the courtroom after Sykes has been sentenced. Actually, I think he got life without parole, actually. So
yeah, right.
She realized, I think she gets a note and it just triggers something in her. And she realizes, she sort of puts all the clues together, right? And she goes, hey, that was, juror number 2 is the one, right? And then, she goes outside and she talks to him, sort of confronts him. And this conversation kind of turns to kind of the meaning of justice.
Congratulations on winning your election. I saw it in the paper.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
It's a pretty big deal. Must have worked hard for it.
Oh, I did.
There's a lot of good you can do in that job, I'd imagine.
Sometimes. It's not as easy as you think, though.
It never is.
Sometimes you try and do the right thing only to realize you got it all wrong. And when you figure things out, you realize the guy you're after isn't some psycho. He's not even really a criminal. He's just a regular guy.
But if it was an accident,
There's no accident.
it's impossible to prove either way. Just like him not realizing at the time that he hit someone with his car. You just have to trust him.
Why would I do that?
Because he's a good person. He's caught in terrible circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. This is that's a tough one.
He has a family depending on him, just like you have people depending on you.
And what about justice?
Well, sometimes the truth isn't justice.
You really believe that?
If you keep going with this, the press will eat you alive. Okay, this case will follow you forever. In the meantime, some politician will take your job. A criminal goes back on the street, and a good man and his family will be just destroyed. Where's the justice in that?
So what do you think were some of the kind of competing points of view here?
I thought the competing points of view related to something that's actually goes through the movie in various ways. It's sort of the difference between somebody being what you would call a, quote, good person, unquote, versus a bad person, compared with who actually did it. What is the truth? And actually, in the law, there are protections for a criminal defendant against just being convicted because he's a bad person. Just propensity to crime evidence cannot come in generally. And that's basically the discussion. I mean, she says something to the effect of, sometimes things you find out you got it all wrong, and it turns out the person you think is a criminal is not, is just sort of a regular guy, and he's not a psycho or anything like that. And then he says something along the lines that, maybe she should just let this go and not pursue it. And she says, why would I do that? And he says, well, maybe because you trust him. And that's when she says, why would I do that? And he says, well, because he's a really good person. And that sort of relates to, in the jury room, Marcus King, who is the juror who is the most intransigent for conviction, says that he's never going to vote not guilty. And it's not because he actually sees evidence that the defendant did kill the girl. It's because he sees this tattoo on him that shows he is a member of a gang and he's just a bad guy. And there are various hints in the movie that Sykes, the defendant, has been a bad guy and he's done a lot of other bad things. So it's sort of this tension between what is the actual truth, what really happened, and who committed the bad act versus who's a so-called good person and who's a so-called bad person. And I thought that was a pretty interesting dialogue there at the end of the movie.
No, I agree completely. And, I think it was a really good exchange between them. And I do think, as you said, it connects back with that scene in the jury room with Marcus King, the juror who's, as you said, determined to convict because he thinks because he thinks Sykes is a bad guy. And in a lot of respects, he was. Drug dealing, he's done bad things. He's actually, he is abusive with his girlfriend, which they show. And it's one of the sort of pieces of circumstantial evidence that they use. And King also has a kind of personal issue, reason, right? And I think that here there's a great kind of connection again with the kind of 12 Angry Men with the Lee J. Cobb character who has a strained relation with his son. It affects his view of the defendant. But it turns out, right, that King, the juror in the movie, his younger brother was killed in crossfire caused by the gang that Sykes, the defendant, was part of. So basically, it's one, he's a bad guy, and two, he's got sort of a personal thing against him. It sort of sets Sykes up as the opposite, the bad guy versus the good guy of juror number two.
Exactly.
I mean, the ideal sort of solution would be if the defendant could be acquitted or the case would be a hung jury and be dropped and no one would be prosecuted, because maybe that is sort of like, the ideal outcome, but it's impossible. And so at the end, I really feel like Kemp, I don't know if you agree, sort of crosses over no longer the good guy because he's willing to see Sykes basically go to jail for the rest of his life because he's the good guy.
That's right. I mean, I think that's exactly right. But he's sort of torn up by it. He's got a lot of regrets and unhappiness, but he's still willing to allow that to happen. And I see that as largely the result of the bad legal advice that he got. Because I think if in that earlier scene when he first talks to Kiefer Sutherland, I think that it's possible that they could have developed a strategy that would have allowed him to come forward and explain what really happened. And he would get a lot of sympathy. Now, whether he's still going to get prosecuted for hit and run or not, I don't know. Because you remember, there's a lot of evidence that it was a terrible rainstorm. It was, I think, twice in the movie, it's referred to as a, quote, blinding rainstorm. Nobody seems to connect that up with the eyewitness, but we'll leave that there. And the victim is drunk, so who knows exactly where she was when he hit her. And I think they could have possibly navigated this situation in a way that everything would have come out all right for Justin, but it would have taken a lot of legal work. And I think one other little comment in the movie was where Chakowski, the cop juror, says, somebody says, well, how could this happen? And he says, well, it's because the guy's essentially a legal aid lawyer and they've got 100 cases and the prosecution's only got 10 and they don't have any time to spend on stuff. That's another part of what I think of as the theme of the movie, of the whole system being flawed. And I think that was a little bit overdone. I would hope that the federal or either the federal defenders or the county defenders in Savannah, Georgia, would take a murder case a lot more seriously. And I would think that they would do the kind of examination of forensic evidence and stuff like that would mount a much better defense for Sykes and possibly have the whole situation come out a lot better.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Frank. I mean, I do want to kind of pick up on that because it is a common trope in movies, that only if the defendant had money to pay a private lawyer and public defenders are bad. Many public defenders are very good. And by, contrast, many private lawyers aren't so great, right? So it sort of buys into that sort of trope. It's in a lot of movies. I think the main, to me, and you mentioned this before, it does seem to be missing at least one very important scene. Right. So after the jury begins to deliberate in earnest, right? And the jurors start to come around. You mentioned the medical student. There's also one of the jurors who kind of jokingly, but actually persuasive, watches a lot of true crime. And she's like, the obvious suspect's never the one who did it, right? But anyway, you get all these jurors who start to, realize, hey, I'm not so sure. And the jury's basically deadlocked. And so the film then kind of cuts from Kemp, juror number 2, realizing that he has only one way out, he thinks, which is basically to have the Sykes convicted, or it's going to be him that's going to be under the hot chair. And from that sort of realization to conviction, and it sort of skips the whole other part of the jury deliberations where juror number 2, after helping get the rest of the jury to see the problems, then just basically like almost waves a wand and has them come over and say, no, we made a mistake. He is guilty. I felt like that was in my view, like the sort of biggest flaw in the plot of the movie.
Yeah, I think you're right. I thought that a couple of reasons for that. One is, I think that Clint Eastwood didn't really want that close a comparison to 12 Angry Men. And secondly, to turn those 6 jurors around who seem to be locked into acquittal, at least it's going to take another 15 or 20 minutes in the movie. And he didn't seem to want to do that. So it just seemed to me that was a big flaw. I thought there were a couple of other skip scenes, actually, that I think are worth noting, because I think while the skipping of the juror deliberation scene where they get turned around prevents it from becoming a real jury drama movie like 12 Angry Men. 2 scenes that are not included in the movie from the trial are the cross-examination, if there is any, of the eyewitness, and the cross-examination of the medical examiner, if there isn't any. And instead, we get into the jury room and somebody says, oh, confirmation bias. And then the medical students sort of rips apart the medical examiner. We haven't seen any cross-examinations. So those were a couple of other skipped parts of it. And I think the reason for all of that really is that this movie is about what's going on in Justin's head. And, we get a lot of close-ups of Justin with meaningful looks in his eyes. And, the suggestion being that there's a lot of turmoil, a lot of pain going on, under the surface there. And so I think that's what he wanted to concentrate on. And I thought that part was actually very compelling. But it did require, unless he was going to make a 6-hour movie, it really required skipping over a few things in the legal stuff.
Yeah, and who knows what went on between him and the studio in terms of what was on the cutting room floor. Did the defense cross the medical exam where he said like it could have resulted from something else? Was there? I'm trying to.
Oh yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. He did do that. I guess what I was bothered by was the medical examiner testified that she was killed by a skull fracture, and the skull fracture resulted, in his opinion, from a so-called unidentified, I think he said, non-specific blood instrument. What is non-specific? Excuse me? What does that mean? That was fertile area for cross-examination. And also, the medical student in the jury room points out that, by the way, in addition to the skull fracture, she has 2 broken shoulders. So that's another area of cross-examination. And then he was asked on direct examination, what was the cause of death or something like that, some question, and his answer is homicide. I don't think that would have been allowed either. So I think you're right. There was a little bit of cross-examination, but it wasn't much, and it was sort of disappointing.
Yeah, and it may be, part of it is kind of what you're saying in terms of where it fits in. I mean, it's overall, we could call it a courtroom drama / legal thriller, but unlike some other movies, Anatomy of Murder, it doesn't spend as much time in the courtroom. Unlike 12 Angry Men, it doesn't spend as much time in the jury room. And so, it's sort of pieced together. And it is, I think it's about an hour, 45 minutes. So, maybe they should have given Clint another 45 minutes and, he could have done something. But,
Right.
Well, I mean, Frank, are there any other thoughts you had, additional thoughts or kind of takeaways about the movie?
The idea of the movie was to present a rather dark picture of our criminal justice system. I think a little too dark, in my view. Maybe I'm being a little naive, or maybe it's just the area that I've practiced in. But I think, in my experience, I think that the judges are more conscientious and more invested in making sure that justice is done than this judge was. I think prosecutors have a lot of political pressure on them sometimes, but I think they are trying to do the right thing. And I think that they would be more demanding of their police investigations than this movie suggested. And I think that defense lawyers, whether they're defense lawyers in legal aid or other public service, or whether they're paid defense lawyers, get much more invested in their cases than this defense lawyer did. So I just think there's more to say for the system than this movie showed. But on the other hand, I suppose it did show that even if you have quite a good system, it really depends on all of the participants in that system really being committed to their responsibilities and taking those responsibilities seriously and doing a good job. And I don't think they did a good job in this case. I think maybe the actors did a good job, but I don't think that the participants in the legal system did a good job.
Yeah, it's a lot of places where it can kind of break down, and also a lot of kind of individual sort of moral, ethical choices that kind of can lead to this, what would have been in this sense a miscarriage, or was a miscarriage of justice. Maybe it gets corrected, maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, I think that's another interesting question about the movie is after I thought the ending was great, where she confronts Justin and that's where the movie stops. But it's interesting to think about, okay, now what's going to happen? And unfortunately, I think Justin is in real trouble now because he's got not only the homicide problem, but he's got some kind of juror misconduct or obstruction of justice case coming down the road, and he's going to get no sympathy.
And I have a feeling in Juror number 2, the sequel, Chakowski, J.K. Simmons, the very savvy ex-cop, comes back and starts to piece together, what happened, and realizes, remember Justin tailed him when Chakowski went to the crime scene, right? Starts to piece together and be like, knows that Justin kind of was covering it up from early on. Well, Frank, it's been great to have you on the podcast. So thanks so much for coming on.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much. I think it's really interesting movie and an interesting conversation.